G'day and welcome to the Drive Able podcast. I'm Brad Williams and over there is Ali Akbariam. G'day Ali, how you going?
How you going?
Today we're talking about what to consider for loading wheelchairs and walking aids into the cars with Katrina Barrett. Kat is an assistive technology clinical lead OT. She's a senior clinician with over 20 years of clinical experience, spanning across acute care, community, aged care, rehabilitation, and disability care. Kat is an enthusiastic person who's all about AT, assistive technology, wheelchairs, and mobility aids. Today, we're going to talk to her about what goes into making the right decisions for wheelchairs when a vehicle is appropriately considered. Ali, you excited about this one?
Yeah, I'm very excited. We don't get to speak to non-driving people often, so it's really good.
All right, let's get this underway.
Let's do it.
Welcome to the Drive Able podcast, where each episode you get to listen to two of Australia's leading professionals in the area of driving and community mobility for people with disabilities. In each episode, they interview drivers, carers, and industry experts and share the insider's guide to driving with a disability. Here are your hosts, Brad and Ollie.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to get into today's interview, but before we get started, we just want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors who make this show possible, Mobility Engineering and Williams OT. This show takes time and money to put together, so we just want to say thanks to the sponsors for helping us bring you this podcast. So today is another exciting one. We have a senior occupational therapist, Katrina Barrett, joining us. G'day, Kat. How you going? Can you tell us a little bit, first of all, about yourself, how you're going, how everything is, and a bit about your background of, being an OT and what you do in that space?
Sure. Thanks, Ali. It's really great to be here with you and Brad. My name's Kat. I joined the Williams OT team about a year ago now, and I've been an OT for 20 years this year. I can't quite believe that. But basically, I've worked across lots of different areas. I've worked in the acute hospital setting, community rehab, and aged care, and then came into the disability space about 6 years ago now. And I've really developed over time a real interest in assistive technology and seating and wheelchairs. So joining the Williams team, we thought it was a really great complement to all of the work that Williams do with vehicles and driver training to get that match of how you get wheelchairs and assistive technology into your vehicle so you can use it in everyday life. So yeah, I've just got a real interest in the seating side of things particularly. I really like the hands-on nature of it, and you really have to problem solve everything along the way to find really practical solutions. And it's definitely not one size fits all. You have to really work through the whole process, particularly with people that have really significant postural needs with their spinal positioning and hips and all of that sort of stuff, and pressure care. So it's just an area that I really love, and it's really exciting to be able to explore that at Williams.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and I'm sure Ali, as an engineer, you're going to have a heap of questions because this comes up all the time when we're talking about turnout seats, and in regards to postural alignment with turnout seats. We had auto mobility on, not auto mobility, Brawn Ability on earlier in the podcast series, where we talk about turnout seats and all the availability in those seats. But we've got lots of questions to ask Kat in regards to how wheelchair prescriptions go with car prescriptions. So we've got a lot to explore here. Probably won't be able to fit it all into 20 to 30 minutes, but we'll do our absolute best.
Yeah. So first question I've got is what kind of got you into the assistive tech? Because and is there anything around assistive technology that is that really sparks you? And the reason why I ask is because just speaking to OTs and being in this world, OT is it's very similar to an engineer, which is basically what it does the engineer do, and it's basically can do anything, and that's kind of like an OT as well, right? So you can kind of niche and specialize anywhere. So in one way, it's good because as a career, the world is your oyster type thing. But at the same time, it can be overwhelming. But also, I do like to sell the area of assistive technology a little bit. So what is it that got you into that and into that space?
I guess I sort of started earlier on with fairly basic stuff that's helped people in everyday life, your shower chairs and that sort of stuff. But then really started to see what some of the limitations were, particularly with mobility.
Yeah.
And also for people who have had a wheelchair particularly prescribed that wasn't necessarily appropriate for them, or it was an off-the-shelf option and not all considerations were taken into account, that can make a massive difference on somebody's life and cause a lot of problems. So what I really like with the creative side of it is thinking about those practical solutions and what the new products are on the market that might actually fit those individual needs. It's not about throwing the latest thing at someone and say, off you go, hope this helps. It's about really thinking about how is this person going to use this and how's it going to make their life easier. But with Williams and joining this space and considering the vehicle as well, it means that you really have to think about how is this wheelchair or walking aid or whatever, how is it going to fit in the car, how are they going to take it places, how are they going to get out in the community. And I think until you really think about that, it can actually be quite limiting. And there can be occasions where people prescribe things or therapists prescribe things with the best intentions, but don't actually think through how the person can use this and actually take it places. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to get people out and about and independent. So what got me into it, I'll come back to that part. What got me into it was the fact that you can there are so many different options out there and you constantly have to stay on top of things. And I really like doing the research and having the network with all of our providers as well, and being able to say to some of our suppliers, hey, I've got this new client, these are their particular challenges, what do you reckon we can come up with? And I like doing that process.
What I heard a little bit there, which I think is a big part of it, I can relate to that working in this space as well, is that kind of, I guess, the ability to express yourself creatively in the job, and be like in that kind of creative zone, which is it's normally whenever we're in that zone in our careers, where generally we're in a pretty good place. So it's good to, I guess, be able to be in that place on a regular basis. And from my point of view, as a bit of a sell to this kind of thing, working in the assistive tech, I find that also it's probably one of the more feel-good parts of the industry, because you are helping with products, and generally that product does have an improvement on someone's life. So you do get a lot of like positive feedback often. But then also I find you can be told very quickly when you aren't prescribing correctly, or if there's something wrong as well. So which is also good for that ability to go back and creatively recalibrate, if that makes sense. So and how much have you worked with like how much is your work cross with automotive? And what one thing I want to say before that, I want to build a bit of context of something that we've spoken about on this podcast. And it's good that you work with automotive people directly, because one of the common things we see in this industry is the products that you're talking about, the home modifications, wheelchairs and things like that. Generally, particularly if you've had an accident, or if you've had a acquired disability, generally they are like the first priority, what we find anyway. And then people look at the transport. And then what we find, again, this is sort of generalizing, what we find is that to the point of what you said, thinking it all the way through, that thought of it being all the way through and including that transport element often gets missed. And then when they come to then let's say 1 or 2 years down the plan to start looking at the transport options, then you've got wheelchairs that are not compatible, scooters, or all of this stuff that is all wrong, and got some issues. And this tends to be a common story. So I guess, where do you see that fitting into what you're doing, and how do you come across that?
Yeah, so from a therapy perspective, I think what I've learned to do, and this is really challenged me working with some of our vehicle modifiers as well, because it takes that thinking process to the next step. But when I'm thinking, particularly, I'll use a wheelchair as an example, and I'll use a manual wheelchair because it's probably more common. In terms of prescription, like, I always start with function and what the person needs and how they can propel it and all of those sorts of things. So there are very clear reasons why I choose the wheelchairs that I do and recommend them. But common thing that we come across in terms of getting it into a vehicle and considerations is the frame type. So, obviously with a folding frame, you've got some different options for like a chair topper on top of the vehicle for some options, or you might think about a boot hoist. But you always have to think about the space and how, if that person has a carer, how do they attach it? How much effort is it going to take them to get it in and out the car? If you don't do that step at the wheelchair planning stage, then everything you do is going to mean that they end up with this lovely, expensive wheelchair that's going to be for home use only and isn't going to be able to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So that, to me, is a great shame and not a great use of funding that is limited, and we have to justify it.
Yeah.
So,
What's some of the things that we need to consider? Because, working in the driving space and working a lot with vehicle modifiers, it might be really simple to think, we just need to swap it from a fixed frame to a folding frame to be able to get it in the car.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that we need to consider in that space? Why is that just not so easy?
Well, because if you come back to how the person uses the chair and what their condition is, if it's a really prime example, if somebody who's got a condition like MS, for example, progressive condition, maybe limited use of their upper limbs and limited endurance for propelling their chair all the time, I would then start to think about, when they propel a folding frame, you lose a lot of energy in all the folding parts and components of the folding chair. When you talk about efficiency of propulsion, you actually lose a significant amount of energy in doing that. So if you're talking about a person who's got limited endurance, they need to be in their chair all day, I would probably be gearing towards a lightweight rigid chair, which is going to be more efficient. And depending on the balance and all of that, a rigid frame, because they can be quite compact when the wheels are removed, then it doesn't necessarily make it more difficult to stow in the car. You just have to think about it differently. So a lot of my clients are surprised when I start to say to them, what about a rigid chair? Oh, no, it's too hard to take apart. But when I show them taking off the wheels, maybe putting the wheelchair frame in the back seat with a carer, the lightweight design of the chair, they are incredibly surprised, and it's actually a lot more of an effective solution for them. So
there's always new products coming out as well. So there's always new kind of loading and unloading products. I actually I just saw something when I was in Europe 2 months ago, which is coming out soon, which I think, for example, works in that rigid chair situation, loading on the back seat. Basically, it converts the back seat to like a sliding door, and then a little rail just kind of the seat on the passenger side, the back seat, you take it off, and then a little kind of unit sits there, and your chair sits on the unit, and it's a tiny little kind of arm that just gives it to you from the back door. So it kind of opens the back door that way, like front ways. So it
Okay.
reverses the opening, and then
Yeah.
a little thing just comes out and gives you a wheelchair.
Yep.
So it's pretty cool. But yeah, like
Yeah.
the point is there's all these new kind of technologies that are
Yeah.
being able to customize those little things. And that point about I do want to, particularly for the people in the automotive world, really highlight that point of folding versus rigid, because that is a question that comes up, and maybe even people that are in the modification space not really understanding how much energy you do lose and how much more challenging it is to use a folding chair, because it's very easy to go, well, just go change it for a folding chair. Why don't you just change it, you know? But like you said, every single one of those joints, you've got a little bit of loss in energy, and also probably a little bit of flex, and flex doesn't necessarily mean you've got, when you are, I would guess it's the same with a wheelchair, but if you want a very good, comfortable ride on your vehicle, you need a very rigid vehicle frame. And then you can have a comfortable ride. And if you don't have a rigid vehicle frame, then the vehicle just vibrates and moves everywhere, and it's really, really uncomfortable for the operator. And my guess is going to be the same with a wheelchair.
Yeah, well, vibration is interesting you bring that up, because vibration coming up through the frame can actually cause things like tremors for people who are prone to that. Things like trying to keep their feet on the foot plates if they've got a condition that they sometimes get high tone or spasticity with their legs. It's really trying to cushion the vibration on the ground for a wheelchair user is really important, but also the material of the makeup of the frame itself. You find that particular metals, titanium, absorbs some of that vibration. So everything that we plan, if you're going into a high-end customized chair, everything down to the fabrication of the chair itself is really important, as well as how heavy it is. So, you know, I might prescribe a carbon fiber frame for someone who needs that really lightweight propulsion, but then you've got to consider possible damage and how durable it is as well. So all of that comes into consideration. And if you're thinking about getting a wheelchair into a car, for someone who does that possibly multiple times a day, for an expensive wheelchair, you want to choose something that's going to last the distance as far as possible.
I have a question which we didn't bring up to you, so I don't know if you're going to have a good answer for it, but I'm going to. It just came up. It just came up to me. I thought.
Yep.
So again, the bit of context, and this might be interesting to people listening. You get often people, including myself, for example, we will say things like a Tony Evo with a Coroni can be used as a transport wheelchair. You can have, if you're doing some sports or whatever, you need an X wheelchair, and you might need a Y wheelchair. And I guess maybe as someone who accesses funding, I might think, what number of wheelchairs can I have? What number should I have? And what's really I guess the point is there like a sweet spot of like, hey, a person should be looking to have, let's say, 3 wheelchairs, one for the home, one for transport, one folding, one this, one that. Like, is there kind of like something guideline around that, or is it just too varied for people?
There's not an official guideline, but I guess in my mind, I keep jumping back to some of the NDIS guidelines, because that's what we work with most of the time. So everything that we prescribe has to be reasonable and necessary for that person and in the context of their disability. So if I think about how somebody uses their chair as an everyday chair, I want to come up with a wheelchair option that is going to suit most of their needs, like day-to-day use. If you start talking about, and I want to give them something that they can use both at home and in the community.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's where you start thinking about power assist devices as well, if they haven't got the endurance. But I do have some clients who are in like participate in wheelchair sports, and the design of those wheelchairs is completely different for that activity.
Yeah.
So that is something that absolutely they would need a sports chair for that. But you consider what the purpose is and the frequency of use, I would say. So I try to come up with an option that is probably going to suit them 80 to 90% of the time for the daily activities, one option. But then sometimes I come up with a lower cost option that might be for a different purpose. For example, if they want to just have something that they can go up to the local shops with by themselves, grab a coffee, whatever, but they don't have the strength to do that and they don't do that on a regular basis, you might be starting to think about a scooter.
Yeah.
So for outdoor use.
Yeah.
So yeah. It's not always one thing does everything.
Yeah, so, well, that's why I was asking about that, because again, this is more maybe even directed. I think it's directed for if you're an end user or a client, to get a bit of, I guess, confidence and context as to what you need. Also, really, people working with NDIS and OTs. So would it be, using the wording of the NDIS, would it be classified as reasonable and necessary to think that there is such thing as a all-in-one wheelchair that meets all of your needs at all times?
That's very hard to say without knowing the person, but generally I would say no, it's not going to be one thing that does everything. We have to also look to the future as well for that person's condition to see if it is a progressive condition. Then I have to think about if they're able to propel a wheelchair now, but starting to show signs of some shoulder difficulties or, fatigue or whatever, then you start thinking about how can we modify this wheelchair to give you a bit of extra power when you need it. So that's when you start thinking about power assist. But when people have particular needs for things like their seated position, so for pressure care, for elevating their feet, height elevation for the seat itself, then you start looking at a higher end power chair. So it just needs to be a process that's worked through and consider how the person uses their chair.
Yeah, it's interesting because the reason why I say that is because, again, we've spoken about this in our context, which is with the context of the vehicle, something like a Tony Caroni setup or similar kind of thing. It's to kind of highlight that there isn't a one-size-fits-all chair, and it is okay to have, let's say, a chair for when you're transporting, and let's say a chair for when you're doing the sports, etc., etc. It's not reasonable and necessary to expect that one thing is going to one thing is going to cover all of your forms of life. It's kind of like a pair of shoes, right? Like you don't have just one pair of shoes for everything. You need your sports shoes or your hiking shoes or whatever. It's almost wheelchair is more complicated than that, but sort of similar kind of idea. So let me
I've got a question, Ali. I know you've got heaps of questions, but I've got a question.
Yes, please.
The differences in backrests as well, Kat. We're thinking about size in regards to width and depth and those type of things. Some of the questions have been related towards that. In regards to the frame itself, but what about backrest heights and things like that as well? Because when we start thinking about a boot that a wheelchair has to go into, sometimes width can be a consideration, but more often than not now, with aerodynamics and plastic trim inside, quite often height is an issue. When we're talking about backrests, are there things that, as in the car industry, we actually have to think about in regards to backrests as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking that I forgot to mention that before. I'm glad you brought it up again. So with the wheelchair considerations, going back to the folding frame versus rigid, with the folding frame, a lot of, depending on what brand it is and what model, some of the more off-the-shelf ones, as soon as you fold it, that height of the backrest, you can't really change that. So even though it's folded nice and flat, you're going to have to tip it, or because the clearance is generally quite high for a boot. If you're talking about like a station wagon or a SUV or something like that. So where I normally start is saying, what type of vehicle do you have? How are you planning to get a wheelchair into your car? And with the SUVs particularly, I've started taking a photo of the boot. I take the clearance height and the width, as well as the internal height as well. So from the boot to the inside of the ceiling or roof of the car. Because when I'm choosing a wheelchair design, you can get folding forward flip backrests. But all of the components, you also have to think about the weight that they add to the chair as well. So you can get removable backrests, which are obviously another step in taking the wheelchair apart to get it into the car. I would choose that for someone who needs a bit of extra postural support, or they're a really active user and they need to be able to have a really comfortable backrest, and possibly for a bit more of a sporty style chair, I'll choose a detachable backrest. Having a detachable backrest can mean that the overall height of the chair decreases, and then you look at the height of the armrests and consider how the wheelchair can get into the car, whether you're looking at a boot hoist or something like that.
Some people have backrests that are only, I don't know, 10 centimeters high, and some people have backrests that are more like 20 to 30 centimeters high. Why can't we just go and replace them all at the 10 centimeter height? I know the answer, but I'm just going to put it out there.
Because you have to think you have to think about how much trunk control the person has and how much support they need on the sides as well. If they've got a condition that means that they're sitting slightly, their spine slightly asymmetrical, then we need to think about where we're providing the support so that their shoulders are free to propel the chair effectively. So you don't want to backrest too high because that's going to be restrictive. But if you're sitting in the same chair for, 14 hours a day, you want to make sure your back is supported. And if you go too low and the person gets quite fatigued or they get some back pain, you also have to think about how much support you're providing. So for an active user, generally we look just under the height of the scapula, I'm losing words
shoulder
here.
blade. Shoulder blade,
shoulder blade. Thank you. I was trying to think of another word for it that was easier for people to remember. Anyway, the shoulder blade. So if you look underneath that height, generally for someone with good torso control, that would be an indicator for us for an active user. So
some people just don't have that trunk control, and you have to go higher. So that then impacts on, if we're going for a boot hoist of some sort, then that needs to get underneath the lip of the boot, underneath the seal lip, the roof lip, and that's not always possible.
No, the other thing I thought of as well is that the reason why we don't go super low for some people who are really active users and propel quite quickly, or they're going up a ramp, you go too low in the backrest, or if the chair isn't quite balanced properly, if they don't have anti-tippers, they're going to go backwards out of the chair. So you also have to think about things like that. So, and find a bit of a middle ground.
Yeah. So there might be people that can load it across their body, their wheelchairs across their body. And we know that a huge percentage of lower spinal cord injury clients do that. What are some of the things that you might see later on in life? Because this has actually come up across some of our conversations as well. And how do you, as an OT, help a person consider the pros and cons in regards to shoulder longevity?
Yeah. So with transferring across the body, the person's got to think about how they bend forward to pick up the frame, twist their body as they pull it across themselves. And generally that's a fair bit of strain on the shoulders when you do that. When you do that repetitively over time, and you're also using your shoulders to push yourself around, there's frequently shoulder injuries that we see, repetitive strain injuries. So that's when I start to think about, if the person is driving and they need to transfer their wheelchair in across themselves, that is one option. But there's, in terms of preserving their shoulder function, you're also thinking about how high is the driver's seat? How far down do they have to reach? Do they have the balance? But also that's when you're starting to think about one of the boot loaders that comes around the car. For an active driver who uses a wheelchair, I would start to go down that track, because that's where you can think about easily transferring their wheelchair into the boot or into the tray of a ute, as a client that we've currently got. There's all sorts of options from that perspective.
That's like a Abbey loader type thing, right?
Abbey loader, yeah. I don't traditionally like the cross-body transfers unless it's absolutely necessary and there's no other option. But I'd still be thinking forwards to what other option can we explore down the track if they get a new car. How can we sort of guide them to make some considerations of that?
Yeah, someone once told me it's a bit like a builder. When you're young, you can stack bricks and build walls and lift heavy bags of concrete and all kinds of stuff when you're young. But when you're in your 50s, that might be a real significant back issue and you can't work anymore. So it's about good ergonomics and good manual handling, even if you are young, to preserve it for the future. And you might not think about that right from the start.
The other thing is also, you can't guarantee that you're going to be operating with the best level of functionality, mobility, and control on every transfer. One day you'll have a bad move or a wrong angle, or you're a bit tired or something like that. And then, those are the days which, even when as someone who regularly like exercises, it's the same thing. One day you're not on the game and suddenly you push something in the wrong angle and then you cause yourself an injury. And shoulders, even for myself, they're the worst, because they just take ages to repair, and they break very easily.
I don't know if you can remember who it is, Ali, but who was it that we were speaking to and they said they wouldn't have it any other way though? Because it gave them light, it gave them freedom, and they gave them abilities to go wherever they wanted. I can't remember.
It was. I think his name was John Wilson. Maybe, I want to say. Maybe. I basically. Look, there has been that argument, and I think that is a very good argument. I think that will shift a little bit moving forward, but what he was basically saying was not having the chair, being a bit more manual, being a bit more, doing things a bit more manually, meant that he felt a lot more powerful as a person in general. And so because he felt that way, he made better decisions, and he believes he had a much better life because he was just generally moving through life with a lot more self-confidence, because he was able to kind of be more physical, if that makes sense. And we see that even in people like Matt Caruana, who's very, very strong in his shoulders, and so he just pulls things across. And so you see in his private life, he's living a very strong private life, if that makes sense, in a way. So that was the counter argument, and I can very much see that. I would suggest, though, that might have been a more of an issue you're dealing with in the past, when disability wasn't so common or wasn't so accepted and wasn't so normalized, and assistive tech wasn't so normalized. Like back in the 60s and 70s, it would have been maybe embarrassing to go around with a wheelchair and hand controls and things like that. Whereas now it's everywhere, and you've got Barbie in a wheelchair and all of these kind of things. It's much more, you've got disability communities and all of this kind of stuff. So it's much more inclusive as such. So yeah.
Yeah. Just I can't believe where time flies as much as it does. I mean, we've gone and asked you a whole heap of questions that are not what we prepped you with, but
Nope.
time flies.
That's
But
fine.
I wanna drag it back to winding this up. But is there some advice that you could give participants who are considering an OT to help them prescribe wheelchairs or walking aids, and how that relates to cars and transporting aids? What, if you can narrow it down to a top three or a, your take home message, what could participants, NDIS participants, or people with injuries or people using wheelchairs and they want to get new wheelchairs, what should they be considering?
I think for choosing an OT or when looking at a mobility
Good
aid?
question. Yes, let's start with that question. Let's do that.
In terms of choosing an OT, I would look for somebody that you trust that has experience with working with wheelchair prescription, and potentially a relationship with a car modifier. I think that's really important, because if you can have those two together, of course I'm biased, but if you can have those two together or find someone who's really experienced, it means you're going to have someone who considers lots of these different options that we've spoken about. In terms of considering having a wheelchair prescribed or a mobility aid, I think it's really important for participants to think about, what do I need to use it for, and how much of the day, and where am I going to use it? Those are probably the three main things that really needs to be considered, because it's really easy to, it's really easy to go into a showroom and go, oh, that one looks nice, I think I'll go for that one. But then you don't think about all of the practical things that go with it. So my advice would be, find an OT that you trust that will help you walk through this problem-solving process effectively.
That sounds
awesome.
exciting. That sounds really good. There's one thing I actually did want to ask you a little bit more about, but I actually think that it needs to be a podcast on its own, and that is scripting wheelchairs that you drive from the wheelchair. So yeah, I think that might take up a whole conversation on its own.
Yeah, I think that might be another conversation.
But I would be interested to talk to you about that. Because I think that might be pretty interesting for, considering driving from the wheelchair and what you need to think about when you're scripting that wheelchair, because that's a whole different ballgame, I would say.
I mean, we've talked a lot today about manual chairs, but there is so much that goes into power assist and powered chairs that I think that's a whole nother topic, and they can do a whhole lot of different things. So it might be a different conversation.
No, I reckon
we should back on, Kat. We'll have to get you back on and explore
Part
the power wheelchair side of things, and even things to consider when you are a passenger in a power wheelchair as well. So maybe you're in a Kia Carnival, or you're in a Volkswagen or something like that, or even in an access cab. What things do we really need to consider when we're prescribing for that type of transport? All right.
Sounds good.
Time flies, so we better wind this up and let people get into work. If they're listening to this in their car or listening to this on the way home, get inside. So just before we ask our final question, we want to quickly acknowledge our sponsors that make this show possible, Mobility Engineering and Williams OT. But Kat, we've always got the final question to wind up the podcast. We've learned that cars are more than just getting from A to B. What's something that you've done that's meaningful or special to you that you've used a car for? Is it a special trip, an adventure, or something stupid? Tell us something that you've done in a car that's meaningful to you.
This is a bit of a funny one, but people who know me well, I have a bit of a hobby. I do some artwork in my free time. I've had a few different exhibitions and bits and pieces, so I can remember really well a couple of those exhibitions trying to problem solve getting all these massive canvases into the back of this car. And I'm glad nobody was actually watching me load those. But I have done that on multiple occasions. You get quite good at it. It's like a Tetris game. It's quite interesting.
That's why you're
But
so good at trying to get wheelchairs into the back of
it
cars
is.
as well.
It is.
You've got
That
experience.
was a starting point. Yeah.
One of the most amusing places I ever find just to go hang out and just laugh is IKEA car parks.
Yes.
And watching people do that all the time. It's like
all the time.
yeah. It's just watching the problem solving of how do I get this that I bought into that.
I don't want to pay for transport. How can I do this?
Yeah.
How do I make it fit? All
Sounds
right. If any of our listeners have any questions for Kat, make sure you put a comment down below or reach out to us through the podcast channel. And you can always find Kat at Williams OT.
Thanks very much, Kat.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. And if it's all right with you, we will invite you back on and we'll talk about those power wheelchairs and
that'd be really good.
and so forth like that. All right, stick
Excellent.
around, everyone, because Ellie and I are going to do our top 3 takeaways from what we've learned today. But until then, we're just going to say goodbye to Kat. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks,
guys. Lovely.
All right, welcome back. In this section, we bring you our expert analysis and top 3 takeaways from the interview. This is where we provide more than 30 years of joint experience in the industry, helping people with disabilities to drive and get out in the community in a safe and meaningful way. So, Brad, tell us lesson number 1.
Well, first of all, before we get into that, I just want to say a massive shout out to Katrina. It's great having Kat on board as part of our team, bringing in new knowledge in her little niche area. So, Ali, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to jump to number 3 and talk about working in the AT space, specifically in wheelchair prescription, just like myself, Brad Williams from Williams OT, has narrowed in on driving to become my focus point, so I can put all of my energy, knowledge, expertise into one finite area, so I know as much as I possibly can about that thing there. I knew that I didn't know enough about wheelchairs, so we got her in to help our clients with that side of things, because it takes a narrowed down focus, a real niche, a real mindset to be excited about this area of practice. And she's got so much knowledge, you can just see it oozing out of her.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this endless times about having the right OT, not just any OT. And we've also challenged a lot of the OTs out there that are kind of working in a more one size fits all kind of capacity, that maybe you're not doing the best by your clients, because you do really need to niche down and really need to understand everything in depth, because there's so many little nuances that, comes in through the various niches. And the beauty about that is further to, speaking with Kat, which again, I'll give also a shout out, because speaking to her and listening to her confidence and just the manner in which she spoke, she definitely knows her shit. You can tell that's for sure. That definitely comes across very much so. So that's really, really good. And you can just feel that confidence. And Kat
and I have some heated debates about, no, this needs to work. No, this needs to work. I'm coming from the driving side and she's coming from the wheelchair prescribing side. And we're trying to make it fit, like trying to get the all-in-one wheelchair, the best wheelchair, into the car. And it doesn't always happen. And I think that's what's going to take us to our second point, if we're working backwards here, is that one chair for everything may not work. And that came up in conversation, is that, you said it, Ali, I haven't got one pair of shoes. I've got sports shoes, I've got dress shoes. I'm not going to wear the shoes that I'm wearing today to the gym later on. I've got different needs for mobility. Me personally, I've got different mobility needs, and I need the right products for those mobility needs. It's going to be the same for transport. We may need a transport chair.
Yeah. And that goes back to that, I guess the challenge to anyone, for example, that's from NDIS that's listening, reasonable and necessary. It's not reasonable and necessary, for example, to have one pair of shoes or, one set of whatever, clothing or whatever. You do have multiple activities in your life. If you want to be included within the community, which is the whole purpose of something like the NDIS, you need more than one type of transport, more than one type of mobility. And that's basically it. You may need, like we said, things like transfer chairs, or a beach chair or a sports chair, or whatever the lifestyle suits. Like Kat was saying, if you're going down to get a coffee, you may not need a fandangled chair, something simple where you can just get on and go up the road and get your meal and come back. So and that is what is reasonable and necessary in order to integrate and work within the community. So I think that's really an important point to understand, because again, like I've seen it endlessly, and we've spoken about it here, where people have this big, crazy, F off wheelchair that does absolutely everything. It'll stand, it'll crawl, it'll do this, it'll do that, but it won't fit in any car. So you're not traveling anywhere. You're doing all these fandangled, wonderful things in your living room. So it's kind of pointless, right? So that's also the big element that we've seen so much, and I get really passionate about, is that understand that, hey, it's not that fandangled thing that's going to cover everything.
Yeah, we do actually have a client which has got a folding frame for a rooftop hoist. So a cheap little rooftop hoist. And he's got then a bigger fixed frame wheelchair that goes into his boot. And it might be that when he goes out, he's got two wheelchairs. One for getting in and out of the car, going for a little short propel into the deli to get his milk and bread and that kind of thing. Short little trip. But if he's going to be in it all day, he wheels himself around to the boot, gets out his other wheelchair, swaps wheelchairs, and then he's in his efficient wheelchair for the rest of the day.
That's actually another great segue to the first point. We're doing well on these segues today.
Yeah, we're doing really well today.
And that is something which I learned actually quite a lot about today, personally. And that's fixed. The real big difference with fixed versus folding chairs, and really that kind of all the loss of efficiency, the extra vibration, that flex, no matter how much they're working on making those wheelchairs, as efficient as possible, you just don't get that same kind of rigidity as a stiff frame. And like I mentioned in the interview, it's the same with a car. If you want a good ride height, you want reliability, you want a nice stiff vehicle, stiff frame that's going to be safe, and then you're going to be more comfortable in that.
I could see your engineering brain just going bing, 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 lighting up all over the place. You were like in a pig in mud in that conversation, because I could see your brain going off. But yeah, it's like taking my 4-wheel drive to the racetrack.
Yeah,
it just doesn't have the same rigidity. It doesn't have the same ability to go around the corners. It's got high roll. It just doesn't have that same efficiency to propel easily and move fast. I'm talking about my 4-wheel drive. But if we relate that back to wheelchairs, you want to be able to be as energy efficient. And we spoke about shoulder, looking after your shoulders for life, to make sure that you're healthy, and making sure that when you get older in life and you're still relying on those shoulders to be able to get in and out of bed, or get on and off the toilet, or in and off a shower chair, or whatever it might be, just for the basics of life, those shoulders still need to work. So we need to look after those shoulders, and having efficient wheelchairs is vital. And having a wheelchair that is comfortable for pressure sores and all of those type of things as well. Having the right backrest, because a folding frame, the backrest is usually soft, and usually just straps across that bend and flex really easily, compared to having something that's a little bit more solid or firm or fixed, to be able to give you the comfort for your lumbar area as well. So all of those things need to be considered, and then we've got to think about trying to get those in the car, and it's not always an easy fit, as we've learnt in this conversation with Kat today.
Yeah.
So make sure you go out and you get an OT that knows what they're talking about. I think that's vital, and make sure that they've got a good connection with a car modifier, because we've actually got to try and make this work.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, that's it. Let's wind it up there. and we're going to do our shout out to our sponsors that make this show possible for you. Williams OT, Driver Assessments and Rehab offer all the pieces of the puzzle to assist people with disabilities reach their driving and community mobility goals. I should be able to say that one, don't you reckon? And Mobility Engineering is a team of passionate and dedicated people focused on bringing Australia's largest range of suitable transport options for all walks of life. As we say in every episode, the advice provided in this podcast is general in nature. So if you have any queries about what can work for you, get in contact with your local OT or mobility dealer and set yourself up with a trial, because trials really do put you in the driver's seat. That's it for today.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Ali. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Drive Able podcast with Brad Williams and Ali Akbarian. If you like what you've heard, make sure you like, rate and subscribe. It really does make a massive difference. If you or anyone you know would like to share a story about driving with a disability, or you would like to get in contact, find the show notes, or find the resources mentioned in this episode, you can find us on Facebook. Just search @Drive Able Podcast for more information.